Welcome to Grief Anatomy's first episode, From Grief to Growth, where we unpack the emotional suitcase that loss drops at our door, one messy, heartfelt, and sometimes even humorous conversation at a time. This series isn't just another deep dive into grief with a sad soundtrack playing in the background. Nope. It's a raw, honest, and slightly irreverent space where people come together, anonymously, to spill their hearts, share their stories, and maybe even find a little healing along the way. Each episode features a cast of everyday humans navigating the roller coaster of loss. Some have lost loved ones, others are grieving the life they thought they'd have, and a few are still figuring out what their grief even means. No two stories are alike, but they all have one thing in common. Grief is messy, unpredictable, and, believe it or not, sometimes even filled with moments of unexpected laughter. We're peeling back the layers of loss, from the ugly cry nights to the moments of self-discovery that come when we least expect them. Expect candid conversations, unscripted emotions, and the kind of honesty that makes you feel seen, like finding someone else who orders their coffee exactly the way you do. Whether you're knee-deep in grief, supporting someone who is, or just curious about how humans make sense of loss, this podcast is your invitation to sit with us. Bring your tissues, your dark humor, or just your curiosity. We're making space for it all. Because grief may be universal, but the way we heal is not. That's where the magic happens. Hi there, and welcome to Grief Anatomy, where we dive deep into one of life's messiest, most universal, and most profound experiences: grief. I'm Andy, your host, and if you're here, chances are you've experienced grief in some shape or form. Maybe it's fresh and raw, or maybe it's something that lingers in the background of your daily life. Either way, I want to start by saying this: you are not alone, and it takes incredible strength and tenacity to continue to show up every day, even while navigating the complexities of grief. You should be proud of yourself. I know I am. Today, I have a colleague to help disseminate information and a wonderful banter partner to ease the transition. Thank you for joining me today.
Happy to be here. Thank you for having me. Don't you think that grief is the wildest ride, the weirdest thing? I never thought of certain things as grief, so I never really had a call to address it. So many occurrences and feelings fall directly into the grief and loss category, like my mind was actually blown.
I know, right? It's not like it comes with a map, an instruction manual, or a Grief for Dummies handbook. I wish it did. Though if it did, I bet it would still be confusing there as it is here, in lived experiences. This experience is not a one-size-fits-all. I have found it to be so intimately personal, unpredictable, and, let's be real, sometimes downright bizarre in how it manifests. One moment, you're reminiscing about a loved one with a big old smile, and the next, you're ugly crying in the grocery store or bank lineup.
I have come to realize that grief isn't just about losing a person either. It shows up in unexpected places. I have witnessed it at the end of a relationship, with the loss of a pet, but mostly in the dreams that didn't pan out. I have seen in myself and others those parts of yourself that you've had to let go of over time, or conform to. The confusing part is how and the way life just changes. I no longer had control. It is like grief has a way of creeping into the cracks of our lives in ways we don't always expect, and creating a big, gaping hole that we have no idea how to fill or fix in order to move forward. It can be debilitating and very messy.
Yeah, so good points on all fronts, so maybe. Let's take a moment and really sit with that word, grief. It's not just a 5-letter word that makes people shift uncomfortably in their seats. It's a weight we carry, a story we tell, a love that doesn't have a place to go anymore, and an unknown ending. And we must talk about it, not just in hushed tones or behind closed doors, but openly, honestly, and with a little bit of humor when we can. Because let's be real, sometimes grief is weird, erratic, and bewilderingly complex. Have you ever found yourself laughing at a memory so hard you start crying? Or crying so hard you accidentally snort and start laughing? Yeah, I agree with you. Grief is messy like that. Life is messy like that.
This podcast is here to create a space where all of it, the sadness, the confusion, the unexpected joy, the weirdness, is welcomed. I'll be sharing anonymous stories, some personal, some from you, the listeners, along with expert insights, you being the expert in your lived experiences, some helpful coping strategies, resources and supports, and maybe even a few "why is this happening?" moments. We'll talk about the different shapes grief takes, some of the cultural expectations, stigmas, or judgments around it, and how to navigate grief when the world just wants you to effectively move on. Spoiler alert, there's no such thing as moving on, just self-healing to move forward.
So, find your cozy spot. Maybe it's curled up under a blanket, taking a walk, driving, or sipping a cup of something warm. And take a deep breath. You're in a space where it's okay to feel whatever you're feeling. It is okay to not be okay, whether that's deep sorrow, numbness, anger, relief, or even laughter. There's no timeline, no right way to grieve, just your way. So take your time. One step forward is monumental and should be celebrated, because forward is forward, regardless of societal measurements and standards. Let's take this journey together, one conversation at a time. Let's dive right into the exchange. Welcome to our interview, beautiful anonymous contributor. Share only what you feel comfortable with and take all the time you need, because sometimes topics about grief and loss can be sensitive and triggering. First and foremost, thank you for sharing with us today. Can you share a little about what brought you here today? What type of loss, grief, or healing have you been navigating?
Sure, thank you. Today I wanted to talk to you about my collective grief. This collective grief is in the form of a natural disaster that changed the course of my life most egregiously. There were so many lives that were impacted by the wildfires, and that is where one of my grief journeys began. My family was deeply impacted by this devastation.
That's understandable. It seems like when disaster strikes a community, we often think the story ends when the flames die down or the waters recede. But what if the deepest impacts only begin to surface in the years and decades that follow? Like how stories from the wildfires, from panic evacuations, to insurance nightmares, how these unique stories ripple with collective trauma that continues to shape lives even today, more than a decade later.
Yeah, it was very challenging to go through something like that. Basically, the whole town had this happen to them collectively, but with deeply personal stories and linked experiences of their own, like those that let their insurance lapse only by a marginalized amount, or those affected by the floods when it did rain after, or those with thawed-out deep freezer when the power was turned off. All felt it in some way or another. Everyone was affected in some way. It seemed like everyone had some sort of issue or trauma that plagued them, even to this day. Something this devastating stays with you, forever embedded.
Right. I can see how everyone would be affected, and also how those statistics could be staggering. In just a matter of days, the fires destroyed roughly 1/3 of that northern community, forcing the evacuation of over 7,000 residents. But the numbers only tell part of the story, I bet.
Yeah. And what's fascinating is how this disaster created this unique dynamic of shared yet deeply personal grief. Like when I saw the ashes of my home standing in front of a smoke-filled and still warm destroyed home while trying to care for 2 toddlers was devastating and grief-laden.
That's right. You had a 1-year-old and a 2.5-year-old at the time, is that correct? I just cannot imagine trying to maintain any sense of normalcy for your young children while processing such an overwhelming loss. Could you tell me how the media coverage may have shaped your feelings and experience of grief and loss during that time?
The media coverage was overwhelming, like truly overwhelming. Seeing the images of the destruction replayed constantly made it impossible to escape the reality of what had happened. In some ways, it validated the magnitude of our loss, showing that my suffering wasn't invisible. But at the same time, the media often focused on the spectacle of the disaster, rather than the deeply personal impact on families and individuals. It felt like our collective grief was being broadcast to the world in a way that was impersonal, and sometimes even exploitative. It also created pressure to be resilient and move on, because the world had seen what happened, but they weren't there for the long-term rebuilding process. The anniversaries were terribly hard, and people just moved on and away from the personal date. The day my world upended itself. Well, what really got me was the description of the media coverage. That really affected my healing process. It's like maintaining several different worlds and perspectives of this personal and professional tragedy that became this public spectacle with limited or no support.
I can see that. Studies have shown that intense media coverage of disasters can actually compound trauma for survivors. It's called secondary traumatization, and it can make it harder for people to process their grief privately.
Do you know what's particularly interesting about my experience? The way the media describe those lasting triggers. The smell of burning wood, strong winds, even the news coverage of other wildfires. The media comments about how no one died. But I don't consider that the benchmark for aspects of my grief. It really isn't that bad because no one died. And, at least you have each other, is useless when you experience complete devastation. While listening to constant media coverage on the amount of the fire damage reported by the media, the reporting seems so over the top, in every media outlet and in my opinion, mostly from a financial perspective, reporting more loss margins rather than focusing on the depth of personal pain and personal recovery strategies in place from the devastation. And you know what? There were some losses in the wildfires. It's like my body kept that trauma stored and ready to resurface and argue at any moment. Maybe it was just a survival response, but I really wasn't in a good place on many levels.
Could you tell me about what was your experience grieving a large-scale event alongside your community? Not everyone can understand this unique perspective you have.
Grieving a large-scale event like wildfires alongside my community was both an isolating and unifying experience. On one hand, the shared devastation created an unspoken bond. We all understood the weight of the loss, the fear, and the uncertainty in togetherness. The shared collective grief gave us strength. We supported each other through rebuilding, shared resources, and held space for one another's pain. That said, at the same time, the grief was deeply personal. While we were all impacted, each person's experience was vastly different. For instance, not everybody lost their homes, resulting in survival guilt, while I lost mine entirely without the ability to gather anything. For my family, the loss given our ages, finances, and geographical location felt uniquely heavy. And at times, it was hard to express to others and ourselves how this grief manifested and appeared in our lives, and in a way that didn't seem to overshadow the broader community tragedy, while trying to collectively settle the chaos that cropped up individually and communally. In moments, it felt like my personal grief got lost in the enormity of the event. But seeing resilience in my community also gave me hope. It reminded me that healing was possible, even when the road ahead felt uncertain.
I bet. Can you tell me about the first moment you realized your life had changed?
Oh, the first moment was during the evacuation, and then the wildfire check-in centers, and I knew we might not be coming back to the same town that I left. It hit me hard and fast, and again when I volunteered during the devastation. But the drive back, after the volunteering, going back into town, presented a landscape that was unrecognizable and hard to fathom. That was when I truly grasped that life, as I had known it, was gone, and a new way of life would need to be offered to rebuild and heal if I was going to make it. I really could not stop my fight or flight, my sympathetic nervous system, from activating. I was a hot mess.
Well, that's actually backed by neuroscience. Trauma literally rewires the brain's threat detection system. Research shows that even years later, sensory memories can trigger the same physiological stress responses as the original event. So, if we think about the long-term implications, how does this kind of collective trauma reshape entire communities? Studies of disaster-affected communities show both positive and negative long-term effects. On one hand, shared trauma can strengthen community bonds and increase resilience. But it can also lead to what experts call disaster fatigue, this ongoing state of heightened anxiety and stress. If not cared for or neglected, anxiety and stress can become embedded as an everyday normal system response. Speaking of support, who, if anyone, was there for you during this time? How have or did they support you?
That is a great question. I lost a lot of people during this devastating part of my family's grief over the wildfires. Many people did not know how to support me, and I must admit, I did not know how or what to ask for as support. Honestly, though, it helped refine who wanted to be there to support me, genuinely and sincerely. Those friends became my closest friends, and many of my family members were released for simply not caring. I had some family come out and assist with my kids while I did the laborious paperwork, and also assisted with the fires in Slave Lake. They were incredible sources of support without requiring anything in return. Sometimes, those pieces of support were not about offering advice or trying to fix things for me because, frankly, I could not handle life at the moment. It was just about being there, sitting in the chaos and grief. The family I'm talking about is my sister and mother. The rest of the family just faded away, wanting not to be called on to do anything. I also connected with a counselor immediately, but at that time, it was too soon, and so much grief that I could not calm my body or mind enough to reach myself and articulate some of the issues I was experiencing.
Have there been moments when you felt misunderstood or alone? What did that feel like?
Oh, absolutely. There are days when it feels like no one truly understands what I'm going through. I had a 1-year-old child, a 2.5-year-old who required safety and security, which I could not offer willingly and in good faith. I also had a partner at that time, whom I had to manage their emotions as well as my own. It was so complex, and so many feelings were rooted in such sensitivity and based in survival mode that minor conversations, if they were had, were massive ruptures, leaving us both feeling unheard and unseen. We continued to pile more and more on as the days continued, which compounded our issues and created arguments where there could have been safe passage with grace. Sometimes our grief was isolating, and even though I know others in my situation experienced it, it still felt like no one got it in those particular moments. When you're grieving, people like my in-laws tried to comfort me with cliches like time heals or at least you have each other. And while they meant well, it felt more isolating than helpful because I felt ungrateful. It really made me feel like my grief is somehow not valid, burdensome, or that I should just move on, like that end of. It's a lonely feeling, and it brought up frustration and guilt for not being able to just get over it properly.
Did you notice any impact on your relationships with others or yourself?
Yes. Some relationships grew stronger because we went through it together, but others faded because people didn't understand the weight of the grief and the layers. Upon reflection, I am cognizant that at that time, I had become more guarded and more aware of how fragile things can be, especially with my young children. It changed how I see the world, even to this day.
That really connects with grief being like a hitting wave. You never know when they'll come or how strong they'll be, what direction and what boat you are in, and if the capacity is there to withhold the constant barrage of impact. And what's particularly fascinating is how this type of collective grief challenges our cultural narratives about healing. We tend to think of recovery as a linear process with a clear endpoint, but experience shows it's much more complex.
That resonates with how it was difficult to describe and manage my children's and partner's emotions while processing my own trauma. I felt I had a role, and that role of sucking it up really highlights the complexity and turbulences of all the moments following the fires. It makes sense that it's like navigating multiple grief journeys simultaneously.
Did the shared nature of the grief bring you any comfort or make it harder to process?
Oh boy, the shared nature of the grief was a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it brought comfort in knowing that I wasn't alone. So many others understood the pain and uncertainty of losing so much so quickly. It fostered a sense of solidarity, and that was reassuring. However, it also made it harder to process at times, because grief became almost communal property. It wasn't always easy to separate my personal emotions from the collective loss. There were moments when I felt like I had to suppress my grief because others had bigger losses. I didn't want to keep explaining to them over and over, or because I didn't want to add to the weight of what everyone else was carrying, to be a burden to others in my biggest moment of grief.
Were there any unexpected sources of support that emerged for you during your grief?
Yes. Amid so much devastation, I was surprised by some of the kindness of strangers. People who had no connection to Slave Lake reached out with donations, messages of support, and even opened their homes to evacuees. There was also an incredible sense of community resilience. People who might not have interacted before came together to support one another to rebuild and reconnect with the surrounding devastation. Sometimes, support came from the most unexpected places. Small gestures from neighbors, a kind word from someone who had experienced a different kind of loss, but still understood the weight of grief. Those moments made a lasting impact to this day.
How do you think collective grief continues to affect you today?
Oh wow, hard questions. The collective grief has shaped how I understand loss, not just as an individual experience, but as something that can deeply impact entire communities. It's made me more aware of how interconnected we are and how trauma can ripple through families, friendships, and even across generations. My children still feel it like I do, differently, but still feeling the effects. It's also given me a greater sense of empathy for others going through large-scale tragedies, because I know how long healing takes. The Slave Lake wildfires were over in a matter of days, but the grief and rebuilding lasted for years. Even today, I carry that awareness with me, and it influences how I support others in their own grief journeys.
Research from the field of disaster psychology actually shows that relationship dynamics often shift dramatically in the aftermath of collective trauma. Some bonds strengthen, while others dissolve under the pressure.
That makes me think about what I said regarding support systems, how some family members disappeared entirely while others stepped up unexpectedly. It was a little jarring, to be honest. Hard to count on people when you are a wild mess and need nothing but support.
That's a common pattern in disaster recovery. Studies show that about 30% of disaster survivors experience significant changes in their social networks within the first year.
Well, this really challenges our assumptions about how long disaster recovery should take, doesn't it? It seems true for me, though.
Exactly. And recent research suggests that the psychological impacts of natural disasters can persist for generations. It's not just about rebuilding physical structures. It's about rebuilding a sense of security and normalcy.
Yeah, that reminds me of what I said earlier about my children still feeling the effects today, even though they were so young when it happened.
Could you tell me what emotions have been most present for you during this journey?
Lots going on. A mix of sadness, frustration, and resilience. Some days there's anger at the unfairness of it all. On other days, there's gratitude for what I still have. The emotions shift, but the sense of loss is always present in some way.
Were there any specific triggers or challenges that felt particularly overwhelming?
Certain smells, definitely a burning wood smell, bring everything back in an instant, especially the forest fires. Really windy days set me back significantly, no matter what the weather or conditions are. News stories about wildfires can be overwhelming, like the LA fires or Fort Mac break my heart and bring me back. Even just seeing a place that reminds me of home can trigger a wave of emotions I didn't expect.
What do you think has surprised you most about your grief journey?
How long it lasts was shocking to me. This happened in 2011. I thought it would be something I worked through and healed from and eventually got over. But I've learned that that's not how grief works. It evolves, but it never fully disappears. It becomes an embedded part of you.
What are some unexpected moments or situations that bring up feelings of grief for you, even now?
Very random things, especially around my children, like when I want to pull up baby photos, there are none. As they all perished in the fires, I had a graduation 2 years ago that brought up massive emotions. Heading back to the town or hearing a certain song. Grief doesn't always come from the obvious triggers. Sometimes it sneaks up in the quiet moments too.
Could you tell me about your experience with grief, sharing only what feels comfortable?
Grief feels like carrying something invisible, but it is really heavy. Some days I can set it down for a while, but it's always there, in my past and future. It's shaped me in ways I never expected. but it's also taught me resilience and empathy.
How would you describe grief to someone who hasn't experienced it?
To me, grief is like being in a boat and a wave hits. You never know when it will hit or how strong it will be, if it'll knock you over or simply jar you. Sometimes it completely knocks you down. Other times it's just a ripple in the background. It's unpredictable, but over time, you learn how to navigate it. And that's supported by studies on intergenerational trauma. The loss of family photos, heirlooms, and other tangible connections to the past can create what researchers call memory gaps that affect family identity across generations. There are practical challenges I experienced as well, like food insecurity and overwhelming paperwork from insurance agencies, which aren't things we typically associate with natural disasters. The pettiness of negotiating the price of your loss. This is when you know the strength of your coverage and the business model that offers it.
Research shows secondary stressors often have a bigger impact on long-term mental health than the initial disaster. One study found that dealing with insurance companies and reconstruction logistics was more predictive of PTSD or complex PTSD than direct exposure to the disaster itself.
Yeah, I heard that some agencies were not hard to deal with, while mine was. Dealing with family, partnerships, the loss, and now the intricate details of bureaucratic paperwork did not advance me or my family unit at all. I heard that others receive support through individual and communal grief was impactful and particularly beneficial for those with positive experiences. That idea of just being present rather than trying to fix things, especially from the agencies.
That aligns perfectly with what trauma experts recommend. Studies show that social support is the single strongest predictor of recovery after collective trauma, but it's the quality of that support that matters most. Looking toward what communities can learn from experiences like this, what do you think from your lived experience and what you saw are things that can be done or added?
Well, disaster preparedness experts are increasingly emphasizing the need for long-term mental health support and community rebuilding strategies. I felt with others that it is not enough to just focus on immediate emergency response. That really brings home the message that recovery from collective trauma is both a personal and community journey as well.
And perhaps that's the most important lesson from your story, how individual and collective healing are inextricably linked, and how understanding this connection can help us build more resilient communities for the future. So when you think about your journey, is there a moment or memory that stands out to you?
Yes. One moment that stood out was standing in front of the remains of what used to be our home. The smell of smoke lingered, and the ground was still warm when I went back to help fight the fires. I remember feeling completely numb, like my mind couldn't process what my eyes were seeing. No home, no hope. It was the first time I truly understood what total loss looked like. Not just losing my house, but losing everything tied to it. Like my baby pictures, my kids' pictures, heirlooms, sentimental articles, and memories, gone with no ability to recover.
What do you wish people understood about what you've been through?
I wish people understood that grief isn't just about the immediate loss. It's about all the small, everyday things that remind you of what's missing. It's about the way life changes in ways you don't expect. How rebuilding isn't just physical, but emotional, like every time a massive gust of wind kicks up in fire season, or Fort Mac, BC, etc. It is very triggering for me. It is like I re-experience the emotions and feelings of that day, and all the subsequent days following. I think people move on, but for those of us who lived through it, the impact never fully goes away.
What's been the hardest part of carrying this grief or loss?
The hardest part is that grief doesn't have a clear ending. You rebuild, you adapt, but there are always reminders, anniversaries, smells, sounds. There's also a deep sense of grief for the version of myself that existed before, the one who didn't know what this kind of loss felt like.
How has your understanding of loss changed over time?
At first, I thought grief was just sadness. Now, I know it's more complex and triggering. It's anger, exhaustion, guilt, nostalgia, and even moments of gratitude for what was. I also understand that grief isn't linear. Some days I feel okay, and other days It's like I'm right back in the moment of loss. It's crazy.
What emotions did you experience when you first faced this loss, and have those feelings changed over time?
Initially, it was shock and disbelief, followed by sadness and anger. Being all over the place is frustrating. Over time, the emotions softened. Now, there's more acceptance, but also a lingering sense of longing for what was lost, like pictures, an old life, etc. The pain isn't as sharp, but it still exists in a quieter, more persistent way.
Were there any cultural or personal rituals you followed to honor or remember what you lost? If so, how did they impact your healing process?
I found healing in small personal rituals, like talking about it in a less triggered state, revisiting old photos, and talking about the memories with my family during that time, or when fire season starts every year. Creating some new traditions and healthy strategies has helped too. These rituals gave me a sense of control in a situation where so much had been taken.
Are there things you miss the most about what you lost? What do you hold on to from those memories?
I miss the feeling of home, the comfort of familiarity, the planted roots. I miss the little things, certain smells, family routines, the way life felt before. But I hold on to the memories, and I remind myself that home isn't just a place. It's the people and experiences that make it meaningful.
How has your grief changed over time? Or how did you feel it changed you over time?
It's made me more empathetic and more aware of how fragile life is. Everyone gets hit with grief and loss in all areas of life. No one escapes it. I've also learned that grief doesn't mean forgetting. It means carrying what was lost in a way that allows me to keep moving forward.
What do you wish others understood about living with loss?
It doesn't have an expiration date. Just because time has passed doesn't mean the grief is gone. It shifts, but it's always there in some form.
If someone wanted to support someone like you and this type of grief, what do you think they should know or do?
I think the biggest thing is to avoid trying to fix it for someone. Brené Brown talks about empathy and how to sit with someone, truly sit with the person while they grieve, is a gift to them that very few care to apply and afford. Grief doesn't need to be fixed. What was most helpful was just showing up, offering a listening ear, giving space when needed, and checking in regularly. If I needed something, allowing space to safely ask and accommodate, like when I experienced food insecurities, but felt too insecure to ask for help. Sitting with someone even if they don't respond. Knowing someone's there means more than words can express. And not rushing the process. Grief doesn't have a timeline. Just saying, "I'm here and I'm not going anywhere," can be incredibly reassuring, especially with my previous abandonment issues. Also, allow the person to truly identify how they feel, and let the person feel their grief. Don't try to talk them out of it or minimize it. Grief needs to be felt, not avoided.
What would you say to someone who feels alone in their grief or trauma right now?
First, I want to say that your grief is valid. You feel as you do, so meet yourself where you are at. It is the most beneficial and has better long-term effects. You're not broken, and you don't need to get over it. It's okay to feel how you're feeling, even if it's messy or confusing. It is okay to not be okay. I know it can feel like no one gets it, and that can be incredibly lonely. But please know there are people out there who understand or want to understand you and your situation. There are resources, both online and in person, where you can connect with others. And while it might not feel like it right now, with time, you'll find new ways to live alongside your grief. You're not alone, even if it feels that way. Healing isn't linear, and it takes time. Be patient with yourself. You're doing the best you can, and that's enough.
No matter what type of grief you're experiencing, remember that it's valid and you're not alone. Seeking understanding and support is a powerful step toward healing. Thank you, beautiful contributor, for sharing your story with us today in our segment, From Grief to Growth. Your personal grief journey will assist and support others. We value and appreciate you and your contribution. Now, back to my colleague and me.
Thank you. Grief. The uninvited guest that shows up at the worst times, overstays its welcome, and leaves an emotional mess in its wake. It's that thing we all experience but wish we could unsubscribe from. But grief isn't just about death. It can crash the party after a breakup, a lost dream, a job change, or even major identity shifts. Basically, if something mattered to you and now it's gone, grief is probably lurking nearby, ready to make things awkward.
So, let's define this emotional roller coaster. Grief is our natural emotional response to loss. It's not limited to death. It can stem from any significant change or ending. No one gets a free pass. Every culture, every age, every community experiences grief, but how we process it is as unique as our taste in coffee orders.
You really gotta ask yourself, why is grief so extra? Grief is not a one-size-fits-all situation, nor does it come with an instruction manual. It's complex because it depends on your life experiences, values, beliefs, attachments, relationships, age, and even the level of support you have. It's a chaotic web of emotions that refuses to follow a straight path. The key to growth, though? Stop ghosting your grief. Acknowledge it, sit with it, ugly cry if needed, and, most importantly, find support in the people and resources around you.
Grief is often described as coming in 5 stages by Kubler-Ross. But what if I told you that's about as accurate as saying there are only 5 types of weather? So today, we're exploring how this universal human experience is far more complex than most of us realize.
The weather reference, that's such an interesting way to put it. And you know what really strikes me about grief? How do we try to put these rigid structures around something that's fundamentally chaotic and personal?
Well, speaking of structures, let's talk about Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's famous 5 stages. There is evidence behind these denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance stages. But here's what's fascinating. Research shows that less than 30% of people actually experience grief in this sequential order.
That's not surprising when you think about it. I actually had a therapist once describe grief as more like a pinball machine. You bounce around between different emotional states, sometimes hitting multiple ones in a single hour.
That's exactly what makes this so interesting. And you know what's even more mind-blowing? Studies show that about 40% of people start experiencing significant grief symptoms before a loss even occurs. That's what we call anticipatory grief.
Oh, that reminds me of something I read recently about caregivers of Alzheimer's patients. Something like 70% of them report experiencing intense grief while their loved ones are still physically present. It's this strange experience of mourning someone who's still there.
Right. And that brings us to one of the lesser-known types of grief that really deserves more attention: ambiguous grief. It's like being stuck in emotional quicksand, where there's no clear endpoint to the loss. I am going to try and explain a bit more about what makes ambiguous grief different from other types of grief. Well, imagine you have a family member who's struggling with addiction. They're physically alive, but emotionally somewhere else. Or think about missing persons cases. Recent statistics show that families of missing persons have higher rates of depression and anxiety than those who've experienced a confirmed loss.
That uncertainty must be absolutely devastating. And it probably connects to what they call complicated grief, doesn't it?
Exactly right. And here's something that might surprise you. Studies indicate that about 7% of bereaved people develop complicated grief, where the intense symptoms persist for more than a year. But that percentage jumps to nearly 20% in cases of ambiguous loss.
You know what really gets me? How society often fails to acknowledge certain types of grief, like when people dismiss the loss of a pet or minimize someone's miscarriage.
That's what experts call disenfranchised grief, and it's fascinating because research shows it can actually be more damaging than acknowledged grief. When your pain isn't validated by society, it creates this double burden. You're grieving the loss while also feeling shame about your grief.
That really does make so much sense. And I imagine it's particularly challenging for certain communities, like LGBTQ2S+ individuals who might be grieving a relationship that wasn't or isn't publicly acknowledged.
Right. Recent studies show that disenfranchised grief in LGBTQ2S+ communities can lead to increased rates of depression and anxiety, up to 300% higher than in cases where grief is socially validated.
Those numbers are staggering. So how do we actually help people navigate these complex forms of grief?
Well, here's something interesting. Research shows that the most effective support isn't about trying to fix or solve someone's grief. It's about what psychologists call holding space, simply being present and validating their experience.
That makes me think about how we often try to rush people through grief, like it's something to get over rather than integrate into our lives.
You know what's fascinating about that? New research in neuroscience shows that grief actually creates lasting changes in our brain chemistry. It's not something we get over. It's something that literally becomes part of who we are.
That's such a powerful way to think about it. Instead of seeing grief as this thing to overcome, it's more like learning to dance with a new partner.
And speaking of dancing, let's talk about how grief moves through our bodies. Studies show that about 85% of grieving people experience physical symptoms. Everything from fatigue to actual heart problems. They call it broken heart syndrome.
That really highlights how artificial it is to separate our emotional and physical experiences, doesn't it?
Exactly. And here's something that might blow your mind. Research indicates that grief can actually be contagious within social networks. When one person experiences a loss, their entire community can show measurable changes in stress hormones and immune function.
That really speaks to how interconnected we all are, doesn't it? Grief isn't just an individual experience, but something that ripples through entire communities.
And those ripples can last for generations. Studies of epigenetics show that trauma and grief can actually affect how our genes are expressed, potentially influencing our children and grandchildren.
That's incredible. So, what do you think is the most important thing for people to understand about grief?
Well, looking at all the research, I'd say it's this. Grief isn't a problem to be solved. It's an experience to be carried. And carrying it doesn't mean we're broken. It means we're human.
That's such a beautiful way to put it. And maybe that's what we all need to remember. That grief is really just love with nowhere to go.
You know what? That might be the perfect note to end on. Because at the end of the day, grief is the price we pay for love. And understanding its complexity helps us honor both the love and the loss together. But quickly, before we go, let's have a quick overview of the classic grief cycle, or as I like to call it, the emotional ping-pong match. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross broke it down into 5 stages, but let's be real, they don't always go in order.
Denial. Nope, this isn't happening. It can't be. Won't be. Anger. This is completely unfair and I need to yell into the void. Bargaining. Okay, but what if I just rewind time? Or change one thing? Or bribe the universe? Depression. Welp, everything is terrible. Acceptance. All right, this happened. I can carry this and still move forward.
No one experiences grief in a perfect, orderly fashion. You might loop back, skip some, or get stuck in one for longer than expected. And that's okay. Becoming your own grief expert means understanding that healing is messy, unpredictable, and, above all, personal. Additionally, it is worth exploring the types of grief, because one just isn't enough to fill our first podcast quota.
1. Anticipatory grief, the forewarning feels. Have you ever mourned something before it happened? That's anticipatory grief, the emotional turbulence that hits before a loss is even official. It's common in caregivers, people facing terminal illnesses, and those preparing for a heartbreaking but inevitable change. I have some examples of anticipatory grief. A caregiver watching a loved one with Alzheimer's patient that forgets pieces of their life. A family member processing the emotions of a loved one battling terminal illness. A parent carrying a pregnancy with a fatal diagnosis, mourning the future they once imagined. It doesn't necessarily make the final loss easier, but it does start the emotional prep work.
Great examples. We will now cover ambiguous grief, the loss that won't commit. This is grief's version of a cliffhanger, when loss is incomplete, unresolved, or confusing. It happens when someone is physically there but emotionally gone. Dementia, addiction, emotional detachment, or when they're physically gone but not declared dead. Missing persons, estranged family members. Some examples are a child grieving an absentee parent who is alive but uninvolved, a spouse mourning the emotional disappearance of their partner due to dementia, a loved one vanishes without answers, leaving you stuck between hope and despair. Ambiguous grief is like trying to close a tab on your browser, but it just won't disappear.
And third on our list is complicated grief. When grief hits the replay button. For most people, grief softens over time. But for others, it gets stuck, playing on an endless loop, making it hard to function in daily life. Here are some more examples of complicated grief. A person who, years after losing their spouse, still avoids socializing, work, or any new experiences. A parent unable to find meaning in life after losing a child struggles to engage in day-to-day tasks. This type of grief often requires deeper support, like therapy or grief counseling, to help process the loss in a way that allows for healing rather than emotional paralysis.
The fourth is disenfranchised grief, where grief arises, but society didn't get it or receive the memo. This is grief that the world doesn't seem to validate, when your loss isn't seen as worthy of mourning or support. Disenfranchised grief examples can be, but are not limited to, grieving an ex-partner and feeling judged for still caring, experiencing a miscarriage and being met with, "At least you can try again," losing a pet and hearing, "It's just an animal, you can get another one," or LGBTQ2S+ individuals mourning a secret relationship that society didn't acknowledge in the first place. This kind of grief is real and raw, but the lack of external support makes it that much harder to navigate.
My advice is to stop ghosting your grief. Growth starts with acknowledgement. Grief is sneaky, complicated, and relentless, but it doesn't have to be isolating. The journey from grief to growth starts with naming your pain, finding support, and understanding that loss does not mean the absence of love. It means love has changed form. And with time, support, and self-compassion, growth is absolutely possible.
I agree in this from grief to growth segment that we need to go through it to grow through it, so we might as well make it a scenario conversation. A what would you do?
Grief can be that uninvited houseguest who arrives unannounced, raids your emotional fridge, and refuses to leave. It's the unwanted subscription we can't cancel, the storm we have to weather. If something mattered to you and now it's gone, grief is probably lurking nearby, making things weird.
So, what exactly is this emotional roller coaster, you might ask? Well, grief is our natural response to loss. And loss? Well, that's a broad category. Everyone, everywhere, at every age, experiences grief. But how do we process it and support it? That's as unique as our coffee orders. Some like it straight up, some with extra sugar, and some spill it all over the place.
We are going to outline 2 scenarios that may help to better understand and support someone who is experiencing anticipatory and disenfranchised grief. Scenario 1. Anticipatory grief. A daughter's journey with her mother's Alzheimer's. The situation. Maria, 42, is the primary caregiver for her mother, who has been battling Alzheimer's for the past 5 years. At first, Maria was able to manage her mother's forgetfulness, but as the disease progressed, her mother no longer recognized her. Maria grieves each lost memory and struggles with the emotional pain of watching her mother's personality fade away. She feels sadness, guilt, and exhaustion, but also relief, which makes her feel guilty. What would you do to support Maria while she experiences anticipatory grief?
I would start by providing potential support for Maria, which would look like acknowledging the type of grief. Maria's grief is anticipatory. I would clarify with her, in her words, what type of grief she is experiencing. She is mourning her mother's gradual loss while still caring for her. To support her healing process, I would acknowledge her emotions. By supporting Maria where she is at, I believe that Maria will learn ways in which to validate her own feelings, recognizing that sadness, frustration, and even relief are all normal responses to caregiving, and that I will continue to sit with her to normalize the process. I would encourage her to seek community and professional support in her area and comfort zone. Perhaps there are services for respite or relief providing services, for a break to recuperate. Maybe she has the capacity or drive to join a caregiver support group where others share similar experiences, so I would at the very least suggest it, so she can think about it. I would also talk about siblings or other family members who may be able to assist in the responsibilities of caring for her mother. This may help her feel less alone and isolated. Therapy has the propensity to provide safe spaces for people to process their emotions. I would also try to create moments of staying in the present, meeting themselves where they are at. So instead of focusing solely on what is lost and the grief surrounding it, Maria can practice mindfulness with a particular focus on cherishing small, meaningful moments with her mother, such as playing music she loves or holding her hand. This honors her mother's legacy and the time spent in meaningful moments. She could mark those moments down to refer to later when grief may become overwhelming. Writing the memories of her mother's stories and past experiences preserves memories that can be passed down to future generations as well. Self-care and self-awareness can go by the wayside when grief enters the picture. Recognizing the importance of her well-being and filling her bucket, even by small acts, could help Maria immensely. By Maria scheduling regular breaks for herself while providing intermittent care, her bucket can be slightly filled and nourished. Additionally, asking for help from family members and engaging in hobbies outside her caregiver responsibilities may bring her some peace. By allowing herself to grieve while also practicing self-compassion, Maria could slowly transition from overwhelming sorrow to growth, learning to honor her mother while also taking care of herself.
In our second scenario-based example, we explored disenfranchised grief, the unspoken loss of a miscarriage. In this situation, after years of trying to conceive, Chris and Alex are devastated when Chris experiences a miscarriage at 12 weeks. While they are heartbroken, they notice that many people around them dismiss their grief with phrases like, "You'll have another chance," or "At least it happened early." Chris begins to feel isolated, as though their pain is invisible or not valid. Alex also struggles, but societal norms make it harder for him to express his grief openly.
My lens and potential support for Chris and Alex as they experience disenfranchised grief. Miscarriages are more common than society thinks and mostly unspoken about because they get minimized and devalued as experiences, and that can debilitate those who go through them. Chris and Alex are experiencing disenfranchised grief due to the miscarriage, and tragically, society fails to acknowledge their loss as significant. I would try to help the couple safely navigate their grief by assisting them to find validation in safe spaces when they are willing and able to connect with a pregnancy loss support group, where they meet others who understand their pain while they receive support. I strongly believe it is important for the couple to set boundaries with unsupportive, neglectful individuals, helping them work in a space where they could safely face dismissive comments, learning to say, "This loss is real for us, and we need space to grieve." This honors their loss in a meaningful way and allows them to explore other options and branch out to other means of grieving. They could decide to plant a tree in their backyard as a living tribute to the baby they never got to meet, something meaningful and impactful for the couple, etc.
They may also wish to explore unresolved issues within their relationship due to the loss. That may look like engaging in individual and/or couples therapy. Offer support. There is great merit in working through their grief together and learning to support one another through different expressions of loss. Similarly, educating others about pregnancy loss may be a step forward and cathartic for all parties involved. Chris could find solace in writing a blog post sharing their story, helping to break the silence around miscarriage grief, which is needed in today's world. Through some or all of these supportive steps, Chris and Alex could move from feeling invalidated to finding personal and shared ways to heal, allowing their grief to transform into a lasting tribute to their lost child and loving affection for each other.
We are now going to shift a little bit and explore some possible supports and resources for our listeners. As we continue this conversation on grief, I want to take a moment to acknowledge that while grief is deeply personal, there are strategies and supports that can help us along the way. It's important to know that just because grief feels isolating, it doesn't mean we have to navigate it alone. So, we'd like to share some practical tools and resources that might support you through your journey.
First, let's talk about self-care. When we're grieving, our bodies and minds are working overtime, processing emotions we may not fully understand or know how to express. One of the most important things you can do for yourself is to acknowledge what you need, whether that's physical rest, emotional release, or simply space to reflect. Start small, maybe with deep breathing exercises to help ground yourself when things feel overwhelming. It can be as simple as taking 5 minutes in the morning to sit in silence or taking a walk outside to feel the fresh air and clear your mind. These little moments of peace can help you reconnect with yourself in the midst of emotional chaos.
Another key strategy is journaling or some sort of articulation. Writing down your thoughts, memories, and feelings can be incredibly therapeutic. Sometimes grief can feel like it's swirling around in our heads, leaving us unable to express it. Journaling or abstract art can be a way to give those feelings shape and form. Whether you write about the person or thing you're grieving, your personal reflections, or even just how the day went, getting your thoughts out on paper can help release some of the weight that grief often carries.
Connection is another powerful tool. Even though grief can feel isolating, connecting with others who understand your pain can be one of the most healing aspects of the process. Whether it's friends, family, participating in grief anatomy podcasts, support groups, or even online communities, sharing your grief with others can help you feel less alone. Finding a place to feel seen and heard in a grief support group, in person or virtually, where you can be with others who are walking a similar path. These groups offer a safe space to express your feelings without fear of judgment. For many, these spaces provide validation and comfort, knowing that others are experiencing similar emotions and are open to supporting one another with similar circumstances, thoughts, feelings, and grief.
If you feel that your grief is affecting your daily functioning, professional help can be incredibly beneficial. Grief counselors, therapists, or social workers can provide a safe, confidential space to process your emotions. Therapy can also help you develop coping strategies to manage the overwhelming feelings that may arise. Sometimes talking to a professional can give you new perspectives on your grief and how to navigate it in a healthy way.
And speaking of resources, there are several great organizations and platforms dedicated to supporting those who are grieving. Some resources include Grief, Share, an international support group offering a series of sessions that guide you through the grief process. They offer both in-person and online groups, and their website provides articles, videos, and resources to help you process your grief. The Compassionate Friends. This organization focuses on supporting families who have lost children, offering support groups, online communities, and even local chapters. The National Hospice and Palliative Care Organization, NHPCO, offers helpful resources and guides for those grieving the loss of a loved one, including support groups and articles on coping with grief. Therapists and counselors who specialize in grief and loss are available online via platforms like BetterHelp or Talkspace if in-person therapy isn't an option for you right now.
It's also worth noting that grief isn't just about moving on or getting over it. Sometimes grief involves learning how to live with it and cope, find ways to carry it with you while still finding joy, connection, and purpose in your life. Grief doesn't have to define who you are, but it will likely change you in some way. With time, patience, and self-compassion, you may find that the weight of your grief lightens, or that you come to a new understanding of who you are after grief and loss.
As we have discussed, it is important to remember, too, that grief is not a linear process. Some days will feel easier than others, and that's okay. You may have moments where you feel like you're making progress, and then suddenly be thrown back into the depths of sorrow. That's the ebb and flow of grief. There's no right way to grieve, and there's no specific timeline. So allow yourself to feel what you're feeling without judgment.
Remember, the fact that you're seeking help, that you're exploring resources like this podcast, is already a step toward healing. Grief is a long road, and it's okay if you're not sure where it's leading you. Just starting the journey is progress. What's most important is that you're taking steps, even small ones, toward feeling seen, supported, and understood.
So, let's continue to hold this space together. Whether you're just beginning your grief journey or have been walking it for some time, know that you are not alone. There are supports available, and healing, in whatever form it takes for you, is possible.
Thanks for joining us in this episode today. I hope today's conversation has offered you comfort, insight, or simply the reminder that you're not alone in your journey through grief. Grief is a process, not a destination, and sharing these stories and perspectives helps us all heal a little bit more each day. If this episode resonated with you, or if you have any future ideas or contributions, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Please email me at andy@griefanatomy.com so I can send you a list of questions to help you along with your anonymous submission, Saus. You can also connect and reach out on social media, Grief Anatomy, and don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and follow on Instagram, Spotify, YouTube, TikTok, Facebook, and LinkedIn. It is completely free and helps the channel grow and reach those in need. Let's keep the grief and loss dialogue going. It's how we grow and learn as a community. Be sure to listen on YouTube at Grief Anatomy and Spotify, so you never miss an episode. If you found value here today, consider leaving a review or sharing this podcast with somebody who might need it. Until next time, be gentle with yourself, and remember, every step forward, no matter how small, is progress.